Hi, welcome to Advanced Judaism for Beginners on the topic of Bashamayim, Part 4. I am Ashi and welcome to the channel. So in the last video, we started it by discussing the various historic periods, the various historic eras throughout the transmission of the oral Torah throughout the generations. And what we discuss is that essentially there is the history of the teachings from the rabbis is divided into various historic eras. We discuss the era of the Talmud, before that the era of the Mishnah, then the era of the Talmud, the era of the Savoraim, Geonim, Rishonim, Achronim. So now there's an important note to make, is that there is in understanding that historic time frame, there is a principle in Judaism called Yeridat HaDorot. Literally means the decline of the generations. And the idea of that principle is that, as we said before also, is that the ultimate revelation came at Mount Sinai, when the Torah was given to Moses at Mount Sinai. Now, then there's a decline of the generations, meaning that each generation that comes later is further from that ultimate event, from that ultimate revelation. So obviously the time of the Mishnah, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century, is closer historically to Mount Sinai. It was about 1,000 years later, more actually, 1,300 years later, but closer. The time of the Achronim, were more about 1,800 years later to the event of Mount Sinai than the time of the Mishnah. So the further we go away from that event, there's what's called the decline of the generation. Therefore, because of this idea, the way it works with the oral Torah and with halakha is that a later historic period cannot argue with the previous one, meaning the previous one is what set the precedent, and later generations cannot argue with that. So, for example, if the Mishnah makes a ruling, so the Talmud, which comes later, cannot argue with that Mishnah, unless if in the Mishnah we have two opinions, if there's not a single ruling, rather there's opinions of two different rabbis from the time of the Mishnah, meaning the Tanaim, those were the rabbis of the Mishnah, then the Talmud and rabbis of the Talmud, the Amoraim, can pick a side in that debate of the Mishnah. But if the Mishnah comes with a conclusion of a single opinion, the Talmud cannot argue with that. Similarly, if the Talmud comes with a single opinion, with a single ruling, with a single conclusion, later generations cannot argue with that. Because again, the Talmud, the authority of the Talmud was accepted among all communities. Same thing later when the Geonim era ended, we cannot argue with that. Same when the Rishonim era ended with the Shulchan Aruch, we cannot argue with that. So that's as we were discussing in our last video, the various historic periods, it's important to have that in mind. In halakha, if there's one ruling in a previous era, then we could not argue with that. So bearing that in mind, when we discussed in our topic of lo bashamayim, and again, that question that we're discussing, the issue that we're discussing is if there is a room, is there any room for a divine intervention in the halacha process? Then if we want to discuss, is that possible to have divine intervention or not? Or we might decide that learning halakha is a complete human endeavor, then we have to look at what the earliest era that we can find that discuss this issue, what do they rule? So in our learning, the earliest Jewish literature, halacha literature, that discusses that topic that we found was in the time of the Talmud. So that's how we started. And we discussed that. So the story, the famous story, and again, I refer you back to the previous videos. Now, if the Talmud will give us a conclusive opinion on this issue, to what extent do we rely on divine intervention in the halacha process, then there it will be a closed case. And any previous generation will have to follow that conclusion of the Talmud. But as we saw, the Talmud gives us a story, and Tosfot actually brings another Talmud that contradicts that. And then we said how Tosfot sees it is that he says actually that there is room for divine intervention. And then we brought the Rambam's approach, where in the Rambam approach we saw that there is no room for divine intervention in the understanding of halacha. So we see that in the era of the Rishonim, there are two approaches. So again, when we have a question in Judaism and halacha, the correct way to learn it is to look at the earliest generation that discusses that issue and see is there an answer to that issue? And so that's an important note to make. So now let's continue in today's learning. So again, on the topic of Lo Bashamayim, so the first source I would like to discuss today is from the Sefer Shnei Luchoi Sabris that was written by the Shaloh HaKadosh. His name is Rabbi Yeshayahu Horowitz. He was born in 1555. He was born in Prague. And he's buried, he passed away in the land of Israel. He's actually buried next to the Rambam, next to Maimonides in Tiberias. And the Shaloh HaKadosh was, he influenced a lot the teachings of Hasidus that came later, starting with the Baal Shem Tov. The Shaloh was a very big Mekubal. In fact, he's one of the first ones to actually teach the teachings of the Arizal, another great Mekubal in Europe. So yeah, that's interesting. And in fact, he's called the Shaloh HaKadosh, the Holy Shaloh, which is not everyone gets that title. So he's indeed someone very special. So I would like let's read something from his Sefer, Teiku. Now, in the Talmud, there's a term called Teiku. Literally, it means like we're in a standstill, a draw. Meaning, when there is a question, a debate in the Talmud, and sometimes we cannot resolve it, we cannot reconcile it, we cannot get to the bottom line of it. So quite often, the Talmud will end that conversation with saying, Teiku, it's unreconciled. We agree to disagree, meaning it's unanswered. So you see it a lot in the Talmud. Now let's see what the Shaloh writes about that term. He explains that term. Teiku, bechol duchta betalmud, שהתשובה אינה נודעת לפשוט ממנה היבאיה אומר תיקו. In every place in the Talmud, when there is no answer to resolve the issue, to answer the question, so the Talmud just says the word teiku. Now, what does teiku means? The loshan teiku hu miloshan tik. And the meaning of the word teiku comes from the word tik. Tik means like a bag. A bag. כי כמו שהתיק שבו הספר אינו נודע מה שבתוכו, כך פשיטוס ההיבאיה אינו נודע. Just like when a book is inside a bag, so you don't know what the book is about, right? It's hidden from us, right? You don't know the content of the book. It's hidden from us. So same thing is that when we have a question and we have no answer, we say, it's in the bag. It remained unsolved. It remains a mystery. כך פשיטוס ההיבאיה אינו נודע. So the question is unknown. וכן פירש האורך. And this is the way he saw the Orech wrote. One day we'll discuss who is the Orech. Now he says something interesting. The Shaloh adds another meaning to the word Teiku. Yesh אומרים, Teiku, Rashi Tevas, is an acronym. Teiku is actually an acronym in Hebrew. Tishbi etaretz kushas ve'abayos. Tishbi, the prophet Elijah, will answer all our questions and resolve all our issues. Meaning, whenever the Talmud makes after not making a conclusion, not resolving it, making a conclusion by saying the word Teiku, essentially it's saying that one day Elijah, the prophet, will reveal to us and will give us that answer. Again, Tishbi Yataretz Kushis Vebayas. One day the prophet Elijah will answer our issues. So this is the Shaloh, what he writes. Again, on Teiku, one understanding of it is that it's like a book in a bag. It remains a mystery. Another answer, Elijah, it's an acronym that Elijah the prophet one day will reveal to us that answer. I do want to just add in few words a little bit about Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet. So of course, Elijah the prophet, he's a figure, he's a prophet in the time of kings. Now, throughout Jewish tradition, Elijah the prophet is a figure much more beyond that, his story in the book of Kings. He is considered someone, a prophet, that throughout the generations, he reveals himself. He reveals himself, the tradition goes, by each Jewish bris, by each Jewish circumcision. Throughout Jewish tradition and history, we have different circumstances where Elijah the prophet revealed himself to save Jews from their times of troubles throughout the history. We also have the tradition that he reveals himself during the Passover Seder. The Passover Seder, indeed, we pour the cup for Elijah. So that is indeed, Elijah the prophet transcends himself from all to all generations. And indeed, Chassidut, just as a Chassidus, by the way, excuse me, I jump between the Ashkenazi pronunciations and the Sephardi pronunciations. Please forgive me for that. Sometimes I'll say Chassidus like Ashkenaz, sometimes Chassidut like Sephardi. Please excuse me. So Chassidus it says something very interesting, explains that even though Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses had a higher soul. In fact, he was the highest out of all the prophets, as we explained in earlier videos. And Elijah indeed was lower. But because Moshe was higher, his soul was so high that the body of Moshe became insignificant compared to his soul. Meaning, Moshe Rabbeinu's soul was so high that his body of Moshe Rabbeinu was insignificant. In contrast to Eliyahu Hanavi, where by Elijah, his soul was lower in comparison, he still had a very high soul, but in comparing it to Moshe Rabbeinu, he had a lower level of soul. So the entire role of Elijah the prophet is that his soul completely works with the body and works with it, purifies it, and elevates it. And Elijah did it to such perfection. He was so great and was able to purify and elevate his body to such extent that actually he was not buried down here. Rather, entirely in his body, he went up. In a time of his passing, he went up to heaven. So, interesting enough, Moshe Rabbeinu, a higher prophet with a higher soul, but because his soul was so high, so the body became tafel, became secondary and insignificant to the soul. So Moshe Rabbeinu did not so much work on elevating his body per se, because his body was just nullified comparing to the light and the energy of his great soul. Elijah, that was lower, so because he was lower, he worked so much with his soul, with his body. His soul worked so much with his body that he was able to elevate it, he refined it. So he was actually able to bring his body to heaven. Moshe Rabbeinu, his body was actually buried down here. We're not sure where his burial place, but his body was not elevated so much that he was able to bring it up there to heaven. So I'm just bringing this a little bit Chassidut. I'm just bringing this point is that to understand Eliyahu Navi, he's someone that because he went up with his body to Shamayim, so therefore he was able with his body to come back again to earth throughout Jewish generations. And he reveals himself throughout Jewish generations. So it's a little bit Kabbalah, but I think this is important kind of intro to our next source that we'll be discussing. So by the way, the Shaloh brings this idea is that whenever the Talmud has something unresolved, they say Teiku. One day, Elijah will reveal himself again. He will come in his body, will reveal himself, and will resolve our issue, our halachic issue. Now, of course, this is very interesting because we learned the idea is that the Torah is not in heaven. So how can Elijah, who seemingly will come as a divine figure, resolve to us halachic questions? Interesting. So we'll take a look at our next source. And again, I want to remind that the curriculum I used is based on a website called olamot.net. Credit goes to them. They compile all the curriculum, and again, it's open source. It's open for everyone, so feel free to go on it. Olamot.net. It's in Hebrew, though. Okay, so the next source will bring like this. The next source comes from the Chatam Sofer, the Chatam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Schreiber. He lived mainly in Bratislava. At the time, it was part of Hungary. And just a few minutes, Rabbi Moshe Schreiber, a giant of a rabbi, he's being credited very much for saving the Hungarian Jews from assimilation. Now, he lived in the years of between 1762 to 1839. He passed away in the year 1839. And during his time, that was when the Jewish Enlightenment and the Jewish reform movement started and took a very, very a prominent role in Judaism in Hungary. And indeed, of course, this is very much contradicted. The Reform Judaism very much contradicts Halakha, contradicts Rabbinic Judaism. And there was a very great danger that a lot of Jews will become modern, become secular, and then eventually assimilate. The Chatam Sofer saw that, and he came with the slogan, Chadash Asur min HaTorah, that any innovation is not allowed. Any innovation in Judaism is not allowed. He made during his time, it was still not clear. You saw various Jews, and you weren't sure yet, were there reforms, were there orthodox? The ideas started to come about in Europe, and some people had mixture of ideas. They're not sure. Should we keep the halakha? Is there room for some Reform Judaism? It was very mixed, and it was something new. And indeed, you even had rabbis that were mixed in their ideologies. Again, in very short, Reform Judaism, in its very principle, generally does not recognize the divinity, the fact that the Torah is something divine, and does not recognize the authority of the rabbis in the oral Torah. So that means that they can come and contradict halakha. And again, that's something in its own subject. So Chatam Sofer, he said anything new we cannot accept. He needed to create a very specific boundary, not to allow reform to penetrate throughout his community. And again, it's interesting enough that reform was very strong in Germany, and indeed, most Jews of Germany did not survive. Very interesting historic point. If you look at the time before the Holocaust, interesting enough, the Jews of Germany per se was only 1% of the population. If you looked at other countries before the Holocaust, Hungary, Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Jews there were about 5% or 10% of the population. In Germany per se, it was only about 1%. That's because there was the assimilation in the previous generations. The assimilation in Germany was so strong that there's not too many Jews that survived. In Hungary, the Chatam Sofer is being credited for saving the jury there, because he said no changes allowed. If you think that if Jews had the tradition of keeping on a certain Jewish garment, a Jewish jacket, you cannot change it. A certain language, you cannot change it. No changes allowed. And he was very strong about that and very stubborn about that. Now, indeed, that created a split in Hungary, in the Jewish community in Hungary. And again, when we're saying Hungary, then it's Austria-Hungarian Empire, which composed it a lot. It composed Austria, Vienna, Budapest, Bratislava, Galicia, Romania. So it was a very, very big Jewish population. And indeed, a big percentage went to the Reform. That unfortunately there was a very strong assimilation there, but a very big percentage was saved because of the leadership of Reb Moshe Streiber, the Chatam Sofer. Again, very, very fascinating figure. Some people credit him that he actually wanted to innovate the idea of Haredi Jew. And again, it's long explanation on that. Again, that separation in culture that he created also essentially in a way created Haredi Jews, but again, a different discussion. But he's a giant of a figure and a huge Talmid Chacham, a huge Torah scholar. So now, I took a bit more time than I thought, so I'm going to read the Chatam Sofer a little bit from the outside, and like this. The Chatam Sofer asks about this idea of the Shaloh, where Elijah the prophet will resolve to us halachic questions that we have, and the Chatam Sofer asks, but seemingly he has neshama, lo Bashamayim. So now, very fascinating. The Chatam Sofer answers like this: is that when Elijah the prophet reveals himself only in his soul, like he reveals himself by every Brit and throughout Jewish history, so there, indeed, lo Bashamayim, then Elijah cannot teach us the halacha when he reveals himself in his soul. But in Yom HaBesorah, in the final days, in the Messianic days, when Elijah the prophet will reveal himself in his body, then he's going to teach us halacha. And then he could teach us halacha because then his status will be like any rabbi. So very interesting. This is by the Chatam Sofer. When he reveals himself like an angel, he cannot teach us. Now, even as an angel, Elijah can reveal to us halacha, but we will not learn from him. We will not accept it as halacha, even from Elijah. אך שמסגלה בלבוש גופוי, הרי הוא מגדולי חכמי ישראל, ותשבי תרץ קושס ובייס, בלם תשמעו. But when he's going to reveal himself as a body, in a body, then we will listen to him. So, just concluding today's learning. So, we started with the introduction, and I just clarified is that we started with clarifying that within a Jewish era, you cannot argue with the previous era. So when we have a conclusion in the Talmud or in the Mishnah, we cannot argue with that, the later generations. And therefore, whenever we have a question in halakha, we need to go, what's the earliest source that gives us an answer to that question? Or at least give us some thinking in that question, to that question. Then we brought the Shaloh that told us the word Teiku, which the Talmud always uses it when we have an issue unresolved. So the Shaloh brings the idea that first, it means it's like a book in a bag where it remains a mystery. We don't know the content of it. But then he also give us the understanding is that Teiku is an acronym, Tishbi Taratishil Ikushes Vabayas. The Tishbi, Elijah the prophet will resolve that question. Then we spoke a little bit about Elijah, that according to Kabbalah and Chassidut, that specifically Elijah, because he was in a lower level than Moshe Rabbeinu, so he worked with his body, and to such extent he was able to refine it so much that he ascended with the body to Shamayim. And then we brought the Chatam Sofer is that when Elijah the prophet reveals down here only with his soul, in a spiritual way, he is revealing himself down here, we do not listen to his halacha. But when he's revealing to himself down here completely with his goof, with his body, then he has a status like any other single rabbi. And then we also would discuss a little bit the Chatam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Schreiber, a giant of a leader. So thank you, and have a good evening, everyone.